I'm Alex O'Neill. I'm the Director of Regulatory and Professional Services here at Agilio Dental. As I was saying before, for those of you who don't know me, I've been here for about the last 10 years, starting as a consultant and I'm working my way up within the company. Originally Code, now obviously Agilio, after we joined forces with Isofarm and other companies. And I'm very much, my background is I come from a dental family, as I said before, and so there's 2 or 3 practices in the family at the moment. I think it's 2 right now. And also I've worked in dentistry for on and off my entire life. And compliance, as someone said before, is a bit of my specialist topic, having researched it and now running the research team. So in a pretty decent place to be able to talk to you about this. I'm just going to give a bit of an update first of what's going on before we jump into the actual meat and bones of the presentation, which hopefully you'll find really, really helpful. So the CQC single assessment framework, they have notified us that they will be starting their inspections using the framework in about 2 weeks' time or so. So we are, for those of you who have iComply, we are currently just remapping the compliance report against we've already done the mapping exercise, but we're doing the practical bit in iComply, putting a new compliance report in there against the quality statements. Practically for inspections, the information we've had from the CQC is that there's no change. So the new quality statements is just reordering the way you map the evidence that you look at on an inspection. But practically speaking, the regulations haven't changed. The guidance hasn't really changed. So the actual inspection should feel the same. It's just the report will look different. That said, there are a few things that we're trying to work through and get clarity on. I probably won't cover those in great detail in this webinar. Things like clinical outcomes seems a bit strange because the CQC are going to look at clinical outcomes without looking at the outcomes evidence category. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to assess that. And assessing clinical outcomes for a dental practice is a considerable change because it's something the CQC have never done. And it's something very few practices even monitor. So that looked like a significant new bit of compliance, but apparently isn't. So I don't think the inspections are going to be any different right now, though they have said that there's a couple of things they're going to focus on more, which they always looked at every now and again, but going to look at it a little bit more is MHRA registration for your lab. So they want you to make sure that you're checking that your labs are MHRA registered. Also, if you are doing any lab work in the practice, then, if you're making whitening trays, if you are milling CEREC crowns, you are technically doing lab work, you should be registered with MHRA. So the CQC are going to be double checking that moving forward. They also want to check that any facial aesthetics that are surgical procedures, which are not many, thread lifts is probably the most obvious one. They want to check that that's going to be listed on your statement of purpose. So those are probably the 2 new things that the CQC are going to look at, but not that significant. CQC registration issues. Currently, registration is 3 months delayed, which we've never seen anything like that. 12 months delayed. There's been issues with the provider portal, and if you go online to register with the provider portal, it was asking you 34 questions. It used to ask you, how are you safe, caring, effective, responsive, well led. It's now asking you a question on how you're going to meet every single quality statement, but there's no guidance for dental practices on the interpretation of those questions for dentists, but there is interpretation there for GPs. So it seems like there's a missing piece of guidance. And I'm not quite sure how we're supposed to register. We are still supporting practices with registration, and we found some ways through this maze. So we do have a registration service. We have a very experienced registration inspector. So if you're looking to open a new practice or add an additional practice or anything, then please contact us and we can help you with registration as a service. So there's 3-month delay at the moment. That does also mean that, planning in advance. If you're planning on opening a practice, plan that it's going to take you 6 months to work on the CQC. To get it through CQC. So you probably want to move your timeframes back 3 months, or move them that way 3 months and manage accordingly. DSP Toolkit. So normally the end of May is a big release in iComply where we do a lot of stuff with the DSP Toolkit. We're still going to do some information governance documents. We're looking at some CCTV stuff we want to change slightly based on feedback. But the good news for this year for everyone is that the DSP Toolkit for the first year hasn't actually changed. So every single year, there's usually a considerable number of changes. We have to do a gap analysis, update policies and procedures, potentially create new documents to help people manage, to meet the new requirements of the DSP Toolkit. It's not changed this year. So if you were waiting till the end of May, you can start now, and you should be fine to submit it with the current documentation that's in iComply. So just thought I'd give everyone, hopefully in the chat, is that good news? I think that's quite good news because it's not a considerable update like it is every year. So another news, new Agilio partner. If you are a member of iComply or iTeam, for our independent practices, we have a exclusive benefit scheme with preferred partners who we've partnered up with. And brand new announcement, we've just partnered up with Spot On Business Planning, who are absolutely fantastic. This is run by Andy McDougall, and he's got an amazing team there with Anne Marie and Vicky, and they are. If I didn't work for Agilio, this is probably where I'd want to go and work. It's always the sort of thing that I love, the business side of dentistry. These are consultants, business advisors who will help you towards exit strategy, will help you double your profits. That's what they do. And they'll analyze all your accounts and everything. If you click on that link that came up, I'll just ask for it to come up one more time. I clicked it off, but if we can have that link come up again, we've got a discount. We've got a special offer where iComply and IT members can get 50% off their first month with Spot On. I'd absolutely go and have a look at them. They are really, really good at helping people increase the value of their business and operate a practice more like a business. So, really, really good. Worth looking, worth talking to with them. So now moving on, more news. iComply content and development roadmaps agreed. So we've agreed a content roadmap for the next 12 months. I won't go into the details right now, but it's got some really interesting things in there, such as we've engaged with the absolute best information governance and DSP Toolkit advisors who support people all over the country. And we're going to do a big job over the next 12 months to streamline our data protection document set. When GDPR came out, we completely led the way and created a very comprehensive document set that helped practices meet the challenges of GDPR. And then generally what we do when we lead on compliance in that way is we leave it a few years and then we review and we streamline. So we'll be doing that with the information governance set in the next 12 months, which will be fantastic to work with those guys. And iComply content, we're going to add more digital audits. Obviously, this is a webinar about audits, which I'll get onto in a second. But we're going to be adding a clinical records audit to iComply, which is a very complicated bit of development because it needs to spot trend analysis. It needs to weight things. How important is it if one clinician's not been discussing anxiety and meeting the CG then record keeping guidelines on examinations. So really interesting challenge for us as a team to make it the best clinical records audit that we can. It will be fantastic when we get to it. So we'll be working on that shortly as well. Another thing just to mention, we've just confirmed we've got a special offer on iTeam, which is our outsourced human resources service. Not just a piece of software. You do get the software. You do get the iTeam software, which I think is really, really good. You can use it for Rota if you want the Rota add-on. It's for sickness and absence. Basically, all of that paperwork I used to really dislike as a practice manager, authorizing holidays, stuff like that. So it helps you to streamline all of that so you can focus on where you really need to on your business. The other side of the iTeam is that you've got unlimited HR advice and support, subject to fair use. But if you need help preparing a letter, preparing for some induction, you want some coaching on a difficult conversation, you can pick up the phone, call your iTeam advisor. They will help you write the letter. They will help coach you through a difficult conversation. It's, as an independent practice, it's the service I really wanted when I was a practice manager. And I'm very fortunate that the I teams now come into the regulation and professional services department. So on webinars, you'll hear me talking more about it, but I think it's an absolute no-brainer if you're a business-focused practice to have an HR advisor and outsourced HR on hand. So if you are interested in that, you can book a demo there. To get 30% off, you just need to book and attend the demo by the 14th of May. So worth a chat, worth looking at it, worth exploring it, and then making a decision over whether or not it's something that you would like to take. So I'll just, if we can just put that one up one more time, and then I'll move on to the webinar. So thank you for your patience on the going through the news, everybody. But now we'll get into the meat and bones of the webinar. So I'd like to do I'd like to just do a poll to start off with, just to see what people, I've just did a poll. I think I've started it correctly. So hopefully you'll see a poll. Do you think your practice is meeting legal auditing requirements? Yes, no, don't know. If someone really looked deeply at your audits, would you be worried that they'd find a problem? This isn't linked to any people, by the way. So we're not going to share your results with any regulators or anything. This is just to give a flavor and understand how people feel, about their responses, or about, okay. So interesting. Yes. 43% think yes. Very small amount of people say no. And another amount of people say they don't know. About 50% say they don't. So 42% are saying yes, 8% are saying no, and 50% are saying they don't know. So I think that's quite an interesting place to start. So this is what we find. If 10 practices rang up Agilio and said, we'd like you to come and do an audit, and I went to do an audit, 8 of those practices, I would find a problem with their audits, or our team would as well. So about 80% of practices we find have problems with their audits. And they don't realize that they're having problems with their audits. To them, the audits look fine. So where 44% of people on this call are saying yes, I'd say about half of you might be wrong. Because you don't even realize that there's a problem with your audits until someone points it out to you, someone who does this for a living or looks at these things a lot. That doesn't necessarily mean that the CQC would find an issue with it. CQC are looking at a lot in a day. So sometimes they may not spot an issue that someone like us would spot because we're looking very deeply at something, or we're looking to see, if someone didn't just scrape the surface of something, which is something a regulator will do, is in if they find a problem somewhere, they'll then start looking deeper that they may have not found it on the issue. So sometimes we'll go into practices, we'll find problems. They'll say, oh, well, CQC visited us a month ago and it was fine. And honestly, they just dodged a bullet because the inspector didn't look that deeply on it. So this is generally what we find. 80% of practices who ask us to come and do a mock inspection, we ask them to repeat an audit. 85% of practices that join iManage, and some of these are really good practices, as part of iManage, any audit that's done and put in the system, we will review for you and we will give you feedback on whether we've found problems. 85% of practices that join iManage, we find issues with their audits in the first year. By the time we get to the second year and the third year, these issues have gone because we've coached the practice and we've worked through this and we've helped them identify what they need to do. So, and then of practices that fail, so this was 100, we looked at 120, we look at 10 practices every single month that have failed CQC inspection. And we analyze their results. We put these into spreadsheets. This is how we decide what we do, or one of the channels by which we decide what we do in iComply. 88.3% of practices that failed their inspections did so at least partially due to poor auditing. That was part of the reason that they tripped up. So I think it's general to say that dental practices think they're better at auditing than they are. It's not always an issue, but I think it's something I said before. For the last 10 years, I've been doing webinars on auditing. So the messages in this webinar are really, really important for good auditing, I would say. Sorry, my doorbell just rang, which just slightly distracted me, but I'm not going to be able to go and get it. So, inspector feedback. So I'm going to read through these. These are from inspections from the last 12 months. Different inspections, not from the same inspection. So in one inspection, they said the registered person had systems or processes in place that operated ineffectively, and they didn't assess, monitor, and improve. Basically, that practice wasn't doing audits at all. The next one down, practice completed records, audits of patient care records, however, and other audits. However, these were not carried out at the appropriate recommended interval. So they were doing audits, but they weren't doing audits. They weren't doing them at the correct frequency. Also, just note the fact that the CQC in this slide spoke about antimicrobial prescribing. That's going to be an interesting one on whether or not you should do an antimicrobial prescribing audit. And we'll come back to that. We looked at the information collected regarding quality of x-rays. This did not form a full audit, as in there was no summary, there was no action plan, there were no learning points. So a mindset thing here, you will find that people think they've done the audit because they tick the box on a sheet, and they forget that an audit is holistic. It includes data capture. It includes analyzing the results, having an action plan. And unless you've analyzed the results, you've done an action plan, and you've actually dealt with those actions, you've not done the audit. I'd like people to think about that. The audit isn't just doing the document that says audit and ticking boxes on it. It's also not about making those boxes look good, which is something we'll come back to as well. Last three infection control audits had mentioned a large crack in the wall, and nothing had been done about it. So they'd done all the other stuff, but then hadn't followed up. They created their action plan because they knew they had to create an action plan, but they then didn't manage their action plan. So they would have failed on being well led because they haven't managed it. They're not well led. There was no evidence that the audits had been carried out in line with national guidance. So this practice had done audits, but the inspector wasn't quite sure what audits they were doing or why. So this is a competence issue. As in, the person doing the audit probably isn't trained on the guidelines, doesn't understand the guidelines, might have a manager or a practice owner in place who doesn't understand the guidelines either and is relying on them. So they end up doing an audit, but they end up misinterpreting it or not following guidance. Next one, the audits was not reflective of the arrangements within the practice. It stated all staff had Hep B vaccination, there were disposable instrument trays in use, and nail brushes were used, and there were soft toys in the waiting area. And none of those things were the case. So this is desk-based auditing. Someone has sat there at a desk, ticking the audit, saying, yeah, we absolutely do that. Yeah, everyone has Hep B. They've not actually gone and checked the staff files. Do we have Hep B on file? They've not gone and looked in the waiting room. Do we have soft toys? They've just sat at a desk and done an audit. Staff had carried out a disability access audit. Had not carried out a disability access audit. They had an undated document. The document said the toilet was accessible, and the toilet wasn't accessible. That's quite an interesting one. The main reason I put that on there is because when it comes to disability access auditing, people just don't assess the reasonableness of things. It's all about what have you got? What have you not got? If you've not got it, is it reasonable to put it in? And can you make a case for why you haven't put it in? So, in a listed building, we don't have a lift. We have an upstairs surgery. We can't it's not reasonable for us to put a lift in because it's a listed building. Done. But a lot of people don't do that. They don't actually write their justifications. They do the audit. They put in the simple stuff, but they don't write the justifications on the other stuff. So the audit doesn't look great. So if we're summing those up, as the common symptoms that we see, and I probably should say in this webinar, this isn't a webinar where I'm going to literally say, this is what you have to do at this frequency, how many times a year, this is what it needs to look like. I'm a lot more about teach a man to fish, as in I'd rather explain to everybody or help everybody in understanding the problems, the wider framework, what you need to do, the mistakes that come up. And then it's up to you to go off and follow a system or something like that, like iComply, which we'll get to, because it's not black and white and it will change. So I'm not doing that as well because I can't just give people a list of audits that they need to do, and I'll explain why, because it's subject to massive interpretation and compliance is about interpretation. So I'll cover that off what I mean by that in a second. But So going down this list, required audits not being performed. So they're not doing the audits. Audits not being performed at the correct frequency. So one of the big changes in the last few years was the change to the X-ray quality guidance. And the X-ray quality guidance used to say you could do an audit annually, whereas now it's very explicit that it needs to be 6 months. So there was a change to frequency of radiograph quality auditing. So if you're doing a radiograph quality audit once a year, then you're not meeting the guidance, because it's 6 monthly now. So audits not containing a summary, analysis, or an action plan. Doing those things is part of doing the audit. And that's what I'd encourage everyone to think. The audit isn't done until those things are in place. We'll have a look at that as well. Action plans not being completed. They've got the action plan in place. They just don't manage it. I've seen this so many times when you go to a infection control audit, there's a rip in the chair. 6 months later, there's a rip in the chair. And well, when are you going to get the rip sorted out? What's a reasonable time frame to sort out a rip in a chair? Audits being performed at a desk. We just looked at that. And I'll talk more about that later, but, or appearing perfect. This happens a lot with competence issues as well. So, it's impossible that every X-ray in your practice that is taken is perfect. However, quite often you will find audits, not quite often, but more often than you'd think, you will find audits where they've looked at every X-ray in the practice for the last 12, or looked at 100 from each clinician for over the last 6 months, and every single one was a perfect X-ray. Which anyone who's been on an X-ray course or taken X-rays will know that's pretty much statistically impossible. Closer when it's digital, but that's a massive red flag to an inspector. And if that audit's being performed by a nurse who's not X-ray qualified and it's just been delegated to them without any competence, they're going to think that's good. They're going to go, oh, brilliant, everyone's great at X-raying, because if they were competent and they were trained, they would go, well, actually, that's statistically impossible. I remember that from the course. So the dentists aren't being honest when they're scoring their X-rays. That's a big problem. We need to go back and talk to them about that. I've said that audit being performed by team members who lack competence, probably the biggest thing. Delegating it to someone who does not know the guidance, does not understand what they're auditing, does not understand. If you couldn't lecture on the guidance, if you couldn't put together a presentation on the guidance that an audit's based around, or the bit of regulation, then should you be doing the audit? If you couldn't teach someone else what the standard is, should you actually be auditing? Question to ask yourselves: who you make responsible for the audits in your practice. Practice performing poor data capture. What I mean by this is auditing is in a wider quality assurance framework, and if you're not doing data capture, so a good example would be X-ray quality. Every time you take an X-ray, you write down the quality or any issues on a log. We have one in the system for iComply. It's a paper log, or you can do it digitally, but you literally just write the details. It takes 10 seconds. If you've not put that log in place, or you don't have an alternative, as in like in SOE or something, or in Exact, you're logging these things not in the notes in the X-ray bit. And when it comes to the audit, it suddenly becomes very difficult. And people say, well, I can't do 100 X-rays for the last 6 months. I've got to look through 100 patient notes. You didn't set yourself up for success to begin with. You weren't logging the data in a way that would make it easy to audit at the end, because you know that the standard from the guidance is that you need to do 100 X-rays every 6 months per modality, per user. So just another food for thought. Are you setting yourself up correctly? Reasonable adjustments not being assessed. Covered that off with the disability access audit. So why? Why does this happen? I think misunderstanding of legal statements and regulatory requirements. I think that's slightly less important than it used to be, but I'll explain why. But ultimately, I don't think people realize audits are probably one of the most legal things that you're doing in the system, and the evidence is one of the things that they will breach you on. The CQC or HIW will breach you on if you're not doing them and you're not following up. It's all about good governance. It's all about improving your practice, and audits are the way that you do that. Responding to complaints in the same way, looking for trend analysis in complaint satisfaction surveys. It's how we improve our businesses and our practices and reduce risks. Misunderstanding of quality assurance workflow. I'll go through that in a second. Poor leadership and or delegation. I'm of the strong belief that if you don't understand the topic, you shouldn't delegate it. So, registered managers, quite often the owner or the manager, you're responsible for making sure that these things get done. And if you don't understand the standard, if you couldn't assess whether or not the person auditing in your practice has done a good job, then I think that's a big problem, because you're relying on someone and you don't know, and you're in charge. Misunderstanding of audit process. I'll go on to that in a second. So, very busy slide here, which I won't go through in every point by point, and it doesn't have a sedation audit on this. So I was going to add it, but I ran out of space on the slide. So I'll just mention on the sedation audit. If you are doing sedation, the CQC will expect you to do an annual sedation audit. So I won't mention sedation again, but that's just worth saying right now. So these are audits that are in I-compliant, and these are, some of them are legal, some of them are not. And the point that I'm trying to make with this is compliance is about interpretation. So I'll go through these one by one, just quickly, and then I'll go on to the main point with them. Audit of prescription drugs. It's in the Human Medicines Act, but it's not something that the CQC look at. So whether or not it's probably a best practice one more than anything. So it's probably not a requirement for practices. PGDs, again, if you were doing patient group directives, then the NHS expect you to follow the NICE guidelines, and the NICE guidelines say you must audit. So the CQC will never come into your practice and say, show us a PGD audit, but the NHS might. So is that a required audit for you? If you're doing PGDs, we'd say yes. So if you do the PGD activity in I-comply, it will mention you should probably do an audit, and the audit's attached to it, if I remember correctly, or we put it in as a separate audit. Can't remember the decision, and I'm sure I'm going to get a Teams message from someone telling me that in a second. Audit of antimicrobial prescribing. Well, I'm going to jump from this and come back to it. I'm going to go to the audit of infection prevention and control, because this is one we can probably all agree in the chat. We should do an infection prevention and control audit, right? In chat, is this something that we're legally obliged to do? I should have done this one as a poll, but just waiting to see if anyone writes this in chat. Oh, I haven't scrolled down on the chat, so I was waiting for you guys to say something, and mine has frozen. Right. So, people are saying that biannually we have to do this. So there's no law that says that you have to do an infection control audit. What there is in the Health and Social Care Act, it says you should follow the Code of Practice. The Code of Practice is a document, and it's named specifically in the Health and Social Care Act in England. So you go to the Code of Practice, and the Code of Practice has multiple, I've forgotten what the technical name is for them. Let's say they're criteria. I don't think it's criteria. It might be pillars or something like that. And the first three pillars are infection control, domestic cleaning, and antimicrobial stewardship. So it says you should follow the code, and the bit on infection control says you need to follow HCM 105. So there's a link. Health and Social Care Act says the code. You go to the code. The code says follow HCM 105. HCM 105 says you need to do 6 monthly auditing. You need to do 6 monthly auditing. So we do 6 monthly auditing, and the CQC, if you're not doing that, will take that very, very seriously. Domestic cleaning and antimicrobial prescribing are almost the same. As in the Code of Practice, it says you will follow the latest guidance on antimicrobial prescribing, and you will follow the latest guidance on domestic cleaning. So if we take domestic cleaning, the domestic cleaning guidance, which the main guidance comes from the NHS, it says that you do an audit. So we put an audit in I-comply, but we don't stress it as being of high importance because the CQC will never ask you for it. Antimicrobial prescribing is slightly different because the guidance, obviously following that link again, Health and Social Care Act, Code of Practice says that you should follow the guidance. The guidance says you should be auditing, but the CQC don't consider this a mandatory audit. It's not on their list of mandatory audits on the website. However, if you're not doing it, they will mention it in your report, but they will never breach you on it. But sometimes it looks like they might breach you on it. So this is almost the legal status of the antimicrobial prescribing audit is very, very tricky. So we've made it optional in I-comply, and I've been on a CQC inspection where they asked for it, and I was there, and we said, no, we haven't, the practice hasn't done it because it's not a requirement. They wrote in the report that practice hadn't done it, but they didn't breach. So this is why, moving on from this slide, I won't go through every single one, but this is the challenge that we have as a compliance provider, because what the regulator is doing doesn't always match what's in the regulations, and there's a priority going on. Clinical records auditing is not something that Lavanya said, can we please be reminded which ones are mandatory? The point that I'm making is that how do you define what is mandatory? Is it what's in the law? Because if you follow the legal links that I just did, then antimicrobial would be mandatory, but the CQC will never breach you on it. So there's always interpretation and there's always things going on. But I'm going to go through. So we go to the CQC's Mythbuster. The CQC's myth. Actually, sorry, one more to mention on that, which I didn't say, is the audit of the safe use of X-ray equipment is probably the strongest one in the regulations, because it says you must carry out a clinical audit to review your procedures. However, that's one the CQC don't look at. But it's probably, out of all of the audits, and someone can correct me if they disagree with me on this, I'd say it's got the biggest legal standing behind it is the audit of the safe use of X-ray equipment, which isn't the radiograph quality audit. So to say what someone's asked me to say a few words on complaints. It's not considered a mandatory audit. You need to do a summary for the NHS every year, but it's complaints auditing is not considered mandatory, so it would be optional. Putting together the summary for the NHS once a year is also not auditing. It's just putting together a summary. So they're not asking you for actions and everything. So complaints is considered optional by us at Agilio, and the CQC don't look at it in any great depth. So, according to the CQC's Mythbuster, infection control is mandatory, X-ray quality is mandatory, and disability access is mandatory. Now, Rhys Jones, who is our head of compliance, would actually point out that the Equality Act just says you need to do reasonable adjustments. There is no legal duty to audit. So in Wales, HIW do not look for reasonable adjustments, but they do not look that you've done the audit because there's no legal requirement to do the audit. The CQC on the Mythbuster consider an accessibility audit to be mandatory. So, looking at this list again, infection audit, I put green: audits of infection prevention control, audits of disability access, and audits of radiograph quality are considered mandatory by the CQC. Audit of clinical records isn't mandatory, but I would recommend everybody does it because I'd rather have the CQC looking at my audit of clinical records than jumping into my records, and it enables me to find problems. And generally speaking, if you've got a few dentists, there's always going to be some issues with someone's notes somewhere that need improving. You generally will spot that. Audit of domestic cleaning, as I've said, has the same link in it that is used to justify the audit of infection prevention control. The CQC will never look at it. Audits of antimicrobial prescribing, the CQC will look at it, but they don't consider it mandatory. So what am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say here is it's very difficult to say what is mandatory, because how do you define mandatory? The biggest advice I can give you on this is invest in a system like iComply and just follow our advice, because we've got a direct line with the CQC. We will talk to them if something changes. We will also challenge on your behalf if they're asking you for something that isn't a requirement, or if they start asking for something, we will respond. So generally speaking, the best thing to do is invest in a system, follow that system, and don't try and don't get hung up on this idea of mandatory, because everyone's like, what's mandatory? What do we have to do? And it isn't black and white. So what you have to do if you sign up to iComply is what iComply tells you to do, because you've got a team behind that who's constantly looking at this, which I've shown you the sort of research that we do and the depth we go to justify our decisions. So that's the biggest piece of advice I can give you on that. So going back to quality assurance workflow. So this is just what I said is people don't really understand the place of auditing in a quality assurance workflow. And if you've got iComply is a quality assurance workflow. It's built in that way. And it's built around ISO 9001 standards. And in a quality assurance in a quality assurance framework, what you do is you set your standards. So you review your policies and procedures annually. So you'd review your infection control policies, your infection control procedures. You would make sure that what the team are doing still matches them, or that do you need to update your procedures because the team have. What I've found quite a lot of times is that the absolute best nurses will find really good, efficient ways of doing things and still meeting the guidelines. So sometimes you're going to have to change your procedures because they've slightly deviated and found a better route to achieving the same thing. Or sometimes they've deviated and you need to pull them back to the procedures. But setting standards, you review your policies and procedures annually and you remind your team of them, you train them. So once a year in iComply, there is a meeting on infection control to remind the team of the standards, to make sure they understand the policies and procedures. And then auditing is checking that standards are being followed. So auditing is in your whole, it's not something that stands out from reviewing your policies and procedures. Auditing is making sure that your policies and procedures are being followed. And then if you find issues with that, you then make improvements. You might need to change your policies and procedures. You might need to, you might do an infection control audit and find out that the logbooks are not being completed on days that temps come in. And you need to change your induction procedure for temps to make sure that they complete the logbooks. And then you update your induction procedure. So people think of an audit as like, oh, we've got to do these audits, or this audit is something separate from everything, where it's part of the system. Your duty as a provider is to operate a quality assurance system, which is what iComply, if it's properly followed, is and gets you into the pattern of doing. So that's just to help people understand they're not in isolation. They are part of a holistic thing that you are doing. And then stop not thinking of auditing as just, I spoke about this earlier, but not thinking of auditing as just ticking the sheet, just doing the tick, get the sheet done, move on. I've done my audit. The auditing is the whole thing. So like I said before, if you know that the guidance for X-ray quality requires you to do 100 X-rays every 6 months per operator per modality, what have you done to make that possible? Are your clinicians noting that in a way that the audit can be done easily? Or when it comes to that audit, are you going to get major pushback from the team because those X-ray scores and notes have only been logged, in the patient notes, and nobody wants to trawl through hundreds of patient notes to find 100 X-rays? We've had this a couple of times with practices recently where they've rung in and they're questioning, do they have to do the 100 and meet the guidance? And they do to meet the guidance. But the problem is that they didn't set themselves up for success at the beginning. So data collection, so doing the data collection itself, creation, performing checks and actually doing the audit form, I've called that data collection, because you're still collecting data for the audit that is then analyzed. So you then got to analyze the data. You've got to find problems. You've got to find trends. So you do a clinical records audit and you find, I said earlier, that one dentist isn't discussing anxiety to check anxiety levels, which was a major change when the new, I always talk about anxiety levels because it wasn't in the old guidance. And then when the new CG guidance came in, that was a major addition. So I always mention that one. And then creating follow-up tasks, which you can use the follow-up tasks in iComply to do it, and then managing them. So, and then obviously sharing learning with the team, especially clinical records auditing. The amount of clinical records audits I've seen over the years, which have really great feedback, but that's never been shared with the clinician. And then they end up doing it on the day when you're there. Seen that loads of times as well. So this is going to seem really obvious, but it's probably just good to look at it. This is our X-ray quality audit form. And at the end of it, it's got all the sections laid out, but the amount of practices that don't follow this, is quite a lot. But, so I've said there's new grading of AN should be carried out 6 monthly. I said 100 of each imaging modality. If you can, if you've got one dentist who's using an OPG machine and an intraoral and they've done 100 intraoral and they've only done 10 OPGs in that time, fine. You just do the 10 OPGs. as I said, data capture is critical. But then you can see on here, this is what it should look like when it's fully done. You can see they've done a little summary. Overall, 22 images were identified as needing improvement. However, they were still diagnostically acceptable. And then the error analysis goes through what the problems were. And then there's actions required, some training required. These have been signed off. And main learning points at the bottom, have all actions from the previous audit been completed, if there's nothing left over. If you follow this, then if you follow the form, then you should be fine with sorry, I'm struggling to get my words out on that one. If you follow the form, then it will tick all the boxes that the inspector wants to see. Remembering that you've got actions to manage is quite difficult, which is why we introduced the task feature and the related task feature in iComply. It's why we introduced the related task feature to activities in iComply, because then they're tracked for you. So I'd encourage you to use the related task feature in iComply as follow-ups for audits, because we literally added that to the system. So people struggling with this would have a central place to go to just look at their follow-up actions. I can see some chat going on about mandatory audits in the chat. I would, as I say, I'd be very careful with the term mandatory. So someone said domestic cleaning is mandatory there. I don't think an inspector ever looks for it. So yes, legally it's probably mandatory, especially for NHS practices and especially code of practice. But if an inspector doesn't look for it, is it mandatory? I think yes, it probably is. But again, definitions are really, really important. So competence. The main point I want to make here, as I've said, is that the registered manager, in my opinion, should really be an expert in all these topics. And there's nothing to stop you being an expert. You know, I'm not clinical. I mean, I did do a year of nursing years ago, and the alginate would set before it got in the tray, let alone in the patient's mouth. So that probably tells you guys how good I was at nursing. My water temperature has something to do with it. But I'm not clinical, but I could do all these audits and I could lead on them in the practice because I've been on courses and I've read the guidance and I've applied myself to learning the topic. But it's a topic that you need to learn and you need to be an expert in it. And if you're the registered manager, registered managers are legally responsible. This is the CQC's quote. The registered manager is legally responsible for managing the service on a daily basis. They make sure the service meets the quality standards. So you need to be an expert on all these topics. So how can you be legally responsible if you're not competent? If you're not as good an infection control lead as the registered manager as your infection control lead, how do you know if they're any good at their role? How do you know if they're doing the right thing? And how can you delegate it if you're not competent? You might not know, they might not know, and what's being produced is bad, but nobody knows. Or not bad, but just not as good as it should be and could potentially get you in trouble with an inspector, or if a patient complains because something went wrong and they look back at your audits. So I've said here that how do you know your team are doing a good job if you don't have the knowledge to check? The practice owner is the only permanent team member. Is another thing I would say is if you're a practice owner and you're on this and you're the registered manager, if your person who's responsible for all your audits won the lottery tomorrow, are they staying or are they leaving and you don't know how to do any of the audits in your practice? So I encourage registered managers, practice owners, the people who really have something to lose if something goes wrong, to be the experts on this. And it can be really good as well. You can go on courses together. So, infection control lead course, Aura, who's one of our partners. Actually, if someone can throw up the partnership link as well, Aura do the infection control IOM course, recognized course, which we send our team on, to be qualified infection control leads. I'm going to go on it again for a refresher. And just remembering that delegation's a process, not a single action. If you turn around to your receptionist who's relatively new in the business and go, you're now responsible for this audit, that's not delegation. I've been working, Rhys Jones, who's our head of compliance, I've been delegating responsibility to Rhys for various aspects of documents, but I'm still we've been working on it for certain aspects of it, the delegation. we've been working on it for a couple of years because we look at it and then we review and we feed back, and it takes time to delegate something. Obviously this wouldn't take 2 years for something like infection control, but you could take your practice owner, the infection control lead, the manager could go on the infection control lead course together. And then, you can do that for other courses as well. Clinical record keeping courses, radiographic, going on the IRMA update is great for radiograph quality auditing. It'll tell you pretty much anything you know. And this is what you see when you see problems. So if someone's not competent, this is something we see really, really often, then you'll see something like this. They've said, are sharps containers filled beyond the indicator mark? They've said yes, which they shouldn't be, but they don't realize that's a problem. They don't realize that the correct answer to that question is no. So you'll see this with things like nail brushes as the classic one, nail brushes by sinks with infection control audits. People say, there's no nail brushes by the sinks. They'll go out and they'll buy a load of nail brushes because they're not competent enough on HTML 105 they're not competent enough to spot where there's an issue. So it's like I said earlier, if you wouldn't be prepared to stand up and teach a room of people on the topic you're auditing on, should you be doing the audit? Unless it's digital, which we'll get to in a second, unless it's intelligent. So just some common competency mistakes. Log just from different audits, just because these are things you can spot in your practice. Log completion scoring, quite often on infection control audits, people will say all their logs are completed. They don't actually go and look at the logs, and what they'll find is that the week attempts were in, the logs were completed, but they've scored that they've got perfect logs. Nail brushes by sinks, I just covered that off. Actually scoring, answering questions for washer disinfectors when they don't have them in the practice, or ultrasonics. Sharps bin not realizing that it needs to, when it gets a certain amount, when it gets full, I'm trying to, it's 3/4, isn't it? Or the indicator mark. They don't realize once it gets to the indicator mark, then they need to put it away. Water bottles, people always mess this one up. If you're using Alcon, you're not going to take the water bottle off, but there's questions about drying water bottles. People don't realize that you actually say no, we don't take them off, which is the incorrect answer. You then need to justify it and say, but we have Alcon, so it doesn't matter. X-rays all perfect. I spoke about that earlier, statistically impossible. No simple adjustments. They've done a disability access audit, but they've not done simple things like hearing loops, magnifiers. And as I said earlier, actually, justifying the reason for not putting a lift in, actually looking at everything and coming up with what is your justification of why you've not done it, because lawfully that's what you need to do. Not enough X-rays. We spoke about that earlier, and data collection, and not adjusting a clinical records audit to a clinician. So, you've got a specialist in there, but you're using the standard audit, which isn't really directed for specialists, and you need to edit it a bit more. Essential reading, as I said, there's guidance for all of these things. And a good place to start is the guidance, but I don't think most people learn from doing guidance. And I think it's fair to say that CPD is also not necessarily the way to learn either. If you wouldn't be, you'd probably be a very rare person who could be competent infection control lead for doing a 1 hour iLearn course on infection control leads. That's more for an introduction to a topic or a refresher on a topic, making sure you stay up to date. For something big where you're learning something new and being competent, you'd want to send someone on the Aura course I mentioned earlier, or you'd want to send them on an IRMA update course for 5 hours. So you need to, if you want to delegate this stuff, training and investing in training is part of it. So just some really simple rules to think about. Know your guidance. If you're responsible for auditing, you need to know your guidance and you need to know your procedures. Never assume, never do anything at the desk. Go and look, because if you do it at the desk, you'll think you have all Hep B certificates and then you'll be missing 2. And then that looks bad to an inspector. Never give the benefit of the doubt. Be tough. The idea is to find problems and improve, not to ace your audit and be perfect first time. A perfect audit is a massive red flag to an inspector or an assessor from Agilio. And ask, could I prove it? Don't give the benefit of the doubt. Could you prove it? If you couldn't prove it, then maybe say no and make sure you be able to generate the evidence. You can use digital audits. I don't think any of our competitors have done anything like this. We developed what we call our intelligent audits in iComply. So if you answer, no, we have no nail brushes, the audit knows that's the correct answer. If you answer, yes, we have nail brushes, it knows that's the wrong answer, and it will tell you need to get rid of them. So we try and take this out of, reduce this problem by having what we call smart audits that know the answers. And we've got multiple audits in the system. So I'd encourage you to use them, and that will reduce that mistake. And if you need training on that, if you're an iComply member, always remember that our customer success team is available to give you retraining sessions on iComply. If you get a new practice manager, if you're new to the practice and you weren't aware of that, you've got iComply, you can always call us up and request training sessions. So 5 follow-up actions from today. Check for common errors. I went through those common errors very, very quickly. We will record this and send it out as a video at some point. So it'll be on YouTube, and you can have a look and see, you can have a look on YouTube and look at those common errors again. We don't send out the slides because of IP issues. Make sure that the leaders and team members are competent. That is the most important thing, is leaders are competent, and then the team members are competent. Leaders first, team members second, because you don't know if your team are doing a good job if you don't understand the topic. That's number one takeaway from today. Go on courses if you need. Invest. Courses aren't that expensive, and paying for them once with your team member and making sure that your team members are trained in this stuff means you're never going to have an issue with it, or you're going to reduce the likelihood of issues significantly. Use the digital audits. They eliminate a lot of these issues. So I'd encourage you to use the digital audits in iComply. And if you want to, you can invest in consultancy or outsourced management. As I said earlier, iManage, we've been running for about 2 years now, coming up to 2 years. And iManage is 85, I've forgotten the statistic. 85% of practices that come on it in the first year, we find these issues and we fix them with the practice and we coach. So this is something we're very used to spotting, and any audit that is put into iManage over that 3-year period gets reviewed and gets feedback from your iManager. So I think there might be a pop-up on iManage coming up in a second. So if you're interested in iManage, please have a click on that. And have a chat. Best thing about iManage, the best news that, other than the fantastic satisfaction that we've had of it, was people have used the time that the average time freed up is the equivalent of 1 month of working time per year. So it's something like 160 hours is the average time that an iManage practice has freed up. What could you do with an extra month to grow patient revenue? And some practices have grown their revenue way beyond the investment they've made in iManage. So we're really proud of that. I'm really proud of that because it was kind of my baby. But I'm going to move on past that one. So that is the end of the webinar. Thank you all for listening.